Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It had been one of those days, the kind where everything felt off, but you couldn't put your finger on why. The kind of day where your thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind, and no matter how much you try to make sense of them, they just slip through your fingers. I had been walking around the city for hours, just to clear my head. I didn't have a particular destination, but I was tired, and it was starting to get late. My legs ached from walking, and I had barely noticed the time until I looked at my watch and realized it was nearly dusk. I was hungry, so I started looking for a place to sit, to relax for a while. That's when I saw the cafe. It wasn't the kind of place I would usually go, but something about it caught my attention. The warm light spilling through the windows, the faint hum of music from within it, seemed inviting in its quiet, unassuming way. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a few people inside, scattered at tables, lost in their own worlds. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing to make me think twice. I walked in. The door chimed softly as it closed behind me, and I was immediately enveloped in the warm, rich smell of coffee, cinnamon, and something else I couldn't quite place. The cafe was cozy, the walls lined with bookshelves, and soft, vintage furniture scattered throughout. It felt comfortable, like stepping into a familiar space, a place I had been before. There was a hum of quiet conversation, the gentle clink of cups and saucers, but something about the place felt odd. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim lighting, then walked toward the counter. The barista behind it glanced up at me, offering a polite smile. I ordered my usual just, a black coffee, and took a seat by the window. There was a strange feeling in the air, like I was being watched, but I tried to brush it off. I sat down, pulling out my phone, hoping to distract myself. But I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. I glanced up, looking around the cafe. The room was full of mirrors. I had noticed a few on the walls when I first entered, but now that I was sitting down, I realized how many there were. Large, ornate mirrors, framed in dark wood, their reflective surfaces hanging in every corner of the room. It was an unusual choice for a cafe, but I didn't think much of it at first. But then, I started to notice something that made my stomach twist. The mirrors weren't reflecting what they should have been. The people sitting at the tables, at least, the ones closest to the mirrors, weren't quite right. Their reflections didn't match their movements. It was subtle, at first small, imperceptible shifts, but it was enough to catch my attention. I watched, my breath caught in my throat, as one of the patrons adjusted their jacket. The reflection in the mirror, though, stayed completely still, no movement, no shift of the fabric. It was as though the reflection was frozen in time, while the person in the chair continued to move. Another person adjusted their glasses, but their reflection did nothing, simply staring straight ahead, unmoving, unblinking. It was like they were waiting. My heart began to race, and I quickly turned my gaze back to the table, trying to calm myself. I must have been imagining things. Maybe the lighting was playing tricks on me, but when I glanced up again, I couldn't stop myself from looking at the mirrors. The reflections weren't just still, they were staring at me. I froze. I don't know how long I sat there, but I could feel the cold, empty gaze of the reflections piercing through me. There were people sitting across from me in the mirrors, people who weren't actually there. Their faces were twisted in strange, unreadable expressions, but their eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, were locked onto mine, as though they could see me, as though they were waiting for something. I turned my head, looking around the cafe, trying to act casual. But when I looked back at the mirrors, the reflections hadn't moved. They were still staring, still waiting. There was no sign of the people I had seen when I first came in. They were just gone, replaced by these strange, unblinking figures that seemed to watch me with an unsettling awareness. I stood up quickly, feeling the weight of their gaze pressing down on me, like they were pulling me into their world. My breath was shallow, my heart racing. I turned to leave, but as I moved toward the door, I felt something cold graze my arm. I looked down, but no one was there. I was about to step out when I heard a voice, soft, almost inaudible whisper, but clear enough for me to hear. "You're the one who's been watching us." I spun around, but there was no one there. No one standing behind me, no one in the mirrors, just my reflection. But it wasn't the same reflection as before. It was me, yes, but the expression on my face was wrong. My lips were twisted into a smile that wasn't mine, a smile that stretched too wide, too unnaturally. I backed away from the mirrors, my breath catching in my throat. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. My reflection in the glass was still smiling, watching me. And then, as if on cue, every mirror in the cafe flickered. It wasn't a glitch or a distortion. The reflection in the glass changed. It wasn't just me anymore. I saw everyone who had been sitting in the cafe, their faces blank, their eyes wide and empty, all staring at me from the glass, their mouths open in silent screams. I ran. I don't know how long I ran for, but I didn't stop until I reached my apartment. I didn't look back, didn't check if anyone was behind me. I just needed to be away from the cafe, away from the mirrors, away from those empty, watching faces. But when I got home, when I finally sat down and tried to catch my breath, I looked at my reflection in the mirror by the door, and for the first time, I didn't recognize myself. My face was wrong. It wasn't the same face I had seen when I walked into the cafe. The eyes were wide, too wide, and the mouth, the smile was too large, stretching unnaturally across my face. It wasn't a reflection of me. It was the reflection I had seen in the cafe. And the whispers began again, this time from inside my own head. "You're not supposed to leave." It had been a long day, the kind that felt like it dragged on forever. Work had been exhausting, and by the time I reached my apartment building, all I wanted was to collapse into bed and forget about the world outside. The street was quiet. The usual hum of city life, muffled by the early evening stillness. As I walked through the entrance of my building, I noticed a strange feeling, like I wasn't alone, even though the hallway was empty. The elevator doors were open, and the soft light from the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly down the narrow corridor. I got into the elevator, pressed the button from my floor, and leaned against the wall, closing my eyes for a moment. The familiar creak of the elevator, as it ascended, did little to calm my racing thoughts. The hum of the machinery was almost soothing, but not quite. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. When the elevator doors opened to my floor, I stepped out, almost ready to head straight to my apartment. But something caught my eye. A piece of paper tucked under my door. It was folded neatly, the edges crisp, and the handwriting on the front of the envelope was familiar, though I couldn't quite place it at first. "Don't look behind you." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My heart beat suddenly too loud. In my ears. Who would leave a note like this? I had no idea what it meant, but the simple sentence felt like a warning, a threat. The weird thing was, I didn't hear anyone leave the note. There had been no sounds in the hallway when I stepped out of the elevator. The building was silent, as it always was at this time of night. The note had appeared from nowhere, and there was no sign of anyone having been here. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was probably just some prank, maybe a neighbor playing a joke, though I didn't know anyone well enough to think that it was something friendly. I picked up the note, carefully unfolding it, my fingers trembling slightly. As I read the message again, something stirred in the pit of my stomach. "Don't look behind you." What was I supposed to make of this? I felt the irrational need to obey, as if the note itself had some kind of power over me. It wasn't logical, but the urge to follow its warning was overpowering. I stood there in the hallway for a few seconds, the apartment door in front of me, the stillness pressing against me like a weight. But as much as I tried to resist, my head turned, just slightly, toward the hallway behind me. The dark corridor stretched into the distance, but there was nothing there, nothing that stood out. Nothing that should have made me feel uneasy. The hallway was as empty as it always was at this time of night. I laughed softly to myself, trying to shake the anxiety off. I was being ridiculous. The note was just some weird coincidence. But when I opened the door to my apartment, something felt wrong. The air inside was cold, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones, and I immediately noticed that something was off. The apartment was completely still, too still, if that made sense. It was like time had stopped inside. My heart began to beat faster as I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room, trying to find any reason why it didn't feel like my home. The light in the hallway flickered above, casting long shadows in the apartment. The kitchen was empty. My living room, normally full of books and clutter, was completely silent. But something caught my mirror in the hallway. A simple, unassuming thing that I'd never paid much attention to. It was different now. It felt different. My reflection in the mirror didn't seem right. I stared at it, trying to convince myself that it was just the light, the shadows playing tricks on me. But there was something about it. I wasn't standing in the same place as my reflection, but it was subtle, like my reflection had moved just slightly ahead of me. It was hard to explain, but I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I stared at it. I turned away, feeling foolish. I should have just gone inside, locked the door, and forgotten about the note. But the voice in my head wouldn't stop. The note, "Don't look behind you." I walked toward the living room, trying to shake off the dread creeping up my spine, but I couldn't. I turned back around toward the hallway, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the mirror. It wasn't me. The person in the reflection wasn't me. Their face was distorted, their eyes wide, empty, staring at me through the glass. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but when I opened my eyes again, the figure was still there, staring back at me with a look that felt wrong, predatory. I was frozen, unable to move, my body unwilling to obey my mind. The reflection in the mirror didn't move, but I could feel its presence growing. The figure in the glass was waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. It felt like it was beckoning me, though it made no move to follow. The room felt colder. The apartment, once familiar, now felt distant. Alien. I turned away from the mirror, my mind racing, and rushed toward the door, pulling it open, only to stop halfway through the motion. There was a sound behind me, a soft thump, as though something or someone had just shifted in the apartment. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was movement. I stood there for a moment, holding the door, listening, but the apartment was silent again. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. The cold, dark air wrapped around me, thick with the sense that something had changed, that something was waiting, just out of sight. And then the whisper came. It wasn't a voice I could hear with my ears, but rather something inside me, the sensation that gripped me as surely as if someone had whispered right in my ear, "Don't look behind you." I closed my eyes tightly, feeling the weight of the words press against my mind. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and my fingers trembled, still gripping the doorframe. But my body moved on its own, my head slowly turning toward the mirror again. My reflection. No, it wasn't me anymore. I couldn't explain it, but the face in the mirror had changed. It was someone else now, someone unfamiliar, with hollow eyes that stared back at me with a sense of knowing. I had been warned. The note, the reflection, everything had led me here. I backed away from the door, feeling the room shift, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me. I could hear my breath, quick and shallow, but nothing else. No footsteps, no sound of movement. And then, something in the reflection moved. It wasn't the figure in the mirror. It was me. I didn't recognize myself anymore. My reflection wasn't mine. The face was twisted, hollow, smiling, and yet I wasn't the one smiling. I wasn't the one moving. I slammed the door shut, but the sound didn't stop. It was like the whisper had followed me, like it had never stopped speaking. I couldn't breathe. The note said, "Don't look behind you." But I had already done it. It was an ordinary evening when I boarded the bus. The day had been long, and I was tired, the kind of tired that makes you feel like you're walking through a fog. I hadn't been paying much attention as I climbed aboard, just thankful to sit down in one of the empty seats and relax for the ride home. The bus was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, their faces lost in their phones or in the quiet hum of their own thoughts. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to shake off the weariness that clung to me like a second skin. The bus rumbled to life, its engine growling as it pulled away from the curb and began its route through the city. The streets were quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes late in the evening when most of the world is already inside. The usual hustle and bustle had faded away, leaving only the occasional car passing by and the low murmur of distant conversations. I closed my eyes. For a moment, letting the rhythmic hum of the bus soothe me, my head tilted back against the seat, and I drifted, just barely on the edge of sleep. The gentle swaying of the bus lulled me into a half-conscious state, a peaceful numbness that made the minutes pass without me noticing. But it didn't last. I woke with a jolt, my eyes snapping open to the sound of the bus's brakes screeching against the pavement. The bus was slowing down, and I glanced out the window to see where we were. But what I saw made my stomach drop. The station ahead was dark, completely dark. The lights were off, the station empty. I couldn't make out any signs or familiar landmarks. This wasn't the usual stop. I hadn't seen this place before. In fact, it didn't look like a stop at all. It was just a long stretch of empty, cracked pavement leading to a small, desolate building that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were boarded up, and the streetlights around it were flickering, casting strange shadows that made the whole place look like something out of a nightmare. I glanced around the bus. The other passengers hadn't seemed to notice anything strange. They were all still sitting, staring blankly ahead or looking at their phones. No one seemed concerned. I turned back to the window, watching the bus slowly come to a stop in front of the abandoned station. The doors hissed open, but no one got off. No one stepped outside. There was a moment of stillness, a heavy, uncomfortable silence that seemed to hang in the air. The bus driver didn't speak. He didn't look at me. He just stared ahead, his hands resting on the wheel. I felt a strange urge to get off, to step outside and see where I was, to make sense of this place. But something stopped me. I didn't know why. It was just a feeling, an instinct. I glanced at the door, but something about the silence of the station, the eerie emptiness outside, made me hesitate. The doors didn't close. The bus just sat there, idling, as if waiting for something. But there was no one outside. No one walking up to the bus. No movement. Just the sound of the wind and the occasional flicker of the streetlights. I looked down at my watch, only to realize that time had stopped making sense. My watch wasn't ticking anymore. The seconds, the minutes, they weren't moving. The bus seemed to be suspended in some strange pocket of time, like it had come to a standstill. I checked my phone, but there was no signal, no bars, nothing. I glanced back at the other passengers. They hadn't noticed. They were still sitting there, some of them with their eyes closed, others looking out the window. No one seemed to be aware that we had stopped at this strange, abandoned station. No one was reacting at all. Then, just as suddenly as the bus had stopped, the doors closed with a soft click. The engine roared to life again, and the bus slowly pulled away from the station. I looked out the window, hoping to see something familiar, but there was nothing. No landmarks, no street signs, just darkness, stretching endlessly in front of us. I started to panic. I wasn't sure where we were going, or why we had stopped at that place. But I had this overwhelming sense that we shouldn't have been there, that something wasn't right. I stood up, my hands shaking, and walked toward the front of the bus. The driver was still staring ahead, his face obscured by the shadows. I couldn't make out his features, but there was something about the way he sat there, unmoving, that unsettled me. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cracking. "Where are we? That wasn't a normal stop. What happened back there?" But the driver didn't respond. His fingers tightened on the wheel, but he didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. I repeated the question, louder this time, but still, no answer. The silence was deafening, and I felt the walls of the bus close in around me. I turned to look at the other passengers, but they were still staring ahead, their faces blank, and expressionless. My pulse quickened. I stumbled back to my seat, trying to keep my composure, but everything inside me was screaming. I needed to get off. I needed to get out. But every time I looked outside, the world beyond the window was the same. Dark, empty, wrong. The bus continued driving, but it wasn't like it was heading anywhere familiar. The streets outside were unfamiliar, the buildings blurred into shadows. The bus didn't stop. The lights from the buildings grew dimmer as we moved farther into the unknown. It felt like I was trapped in some kind of loop, the world outside moving at a pace that didn't match my own. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something had attached itself to me. I had no idea how long we had been driving, but it felt like hours, days I didn't know. Finally, I saw something in the distance, a faint light. It was the glow of another station, one that looked much more normal than the last. My heart skipped a beat. We had reached another stop. The bus slowed down, and I felt the tension in my chest loosen. Maybe now I could get off. Maybe now things would go back to normal. But as the bus neared the station, something else happened. The doors didn't open. The bus didn't stop. It just passed by the station, and it kept going. I stood up again, my heart pounding in my chest. "What's going on?" I shouted. "Why aren't we stopping?" But the bus driver didn't answer. The other passengers didn't move. No one said a word. The bus just kept going, moving further and further from the station. I looked outside, desperately searching for something that looked familiar, something that could bring me back to reality. But the streets kept changing, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. The buildings seemed to warp, the lights flickered, and I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me. And then, the bus stopped again. But we weren't at another station, we weren't anywhere. We were back where we had started. The same abandoned station, the same darkness, the same silence. The doors opened, and I was still inside. It was a quiet night in the city, the kind where the air feels thick and heavy, as if the world itself is holding its breath. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few late-night wanderers, but the usual hum of life had gone quiet. I was walking home after a long day, the kind where you just want to get to your door and forget the world. The city looked different at this hour, darker, quieter, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. I was passing through an alleyway that I usually took to cut through to the next block. A shortcut I'd walked down countless times before. It was narrow, the walls on either side so close that they almost seemed to press in. The only light was a single flickering bulb above, casting a weak, yellowish glow. The alley always felt a bit off, even though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the shadows, or the way the air always felt a little colder here, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. I stepped in, my footsteps echoing off the brick walls as I walked deeper into the alley. I wasn't in a hurry, but something made me look over my shoulder. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my vision, shadow. Too quick to catch, flickering like a wisp of smoke. I turned my head, expecting to see someone, but the alley was empty, just the silent stretch of pavement behind me. I paused for a moment, my heart racing slightly, trying to brush off the feeling of being watched. Nothing was there. Nothing had changed. The alley remained silent. But then I saw it. A flash of light. It was bright, almost blinding, and it illuminated the alley for a split second. It was like the light had come from nowhere, a sudden burst that flickered in and out of existence, as if someone had flashed a camera or turned on a bright light for just an instant. I froze, my eyes instinctively darting toward the source, but there was no one there, no figure, no silhouette, just the empty stretch of the alley, as empty as it had been when I first walked in. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing, my tired mind playing tricks on me. It was late. I was just imagining things. Maybe a car had passed by outside, and the light had reflected off something. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just happened. Something that wasn't right. I kept walking, my pace a little quicker now, trying to get through the alley and onto the other side, but that flash of light kept lingering in my mind. My footsteps seemed louder in the silence, each echo reminding me of the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. I was nearly halfway through when I saw it again, a flash, bright, brief, and completely out of place. This time, it came from the other end of the alley, farther down, near where the shadows grew deeper and the light from the street lamps didn't reach. It was the same flash, the same sudden burst of light, but there was no source, no figure, no person holding a flashlight or camera, just the light flickering like a ghost in the darkness. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave the alley, but my legs wouldn't move. The flash had come again, but there was nothing there. I was alone, and yet something felt terribly wrong. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the alley, searching for any movement, anything that would explain what was happening, but there was nothing. The alley was still, the only sound my own breathing and the distant hum of the city. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever had caused that flash of light was still there, just out of my sight. I stepped forward again, a bit faster now, trying to reach the end of the alley, trying to get out of this suffocating silence. My eyes darted to every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing. And then, it happened again. The flash of light. This time, it was closer, just a few feet away. I could feel the heat from it, the sudden burst of brightness that made my heart race. But when I looked, there was no one. No person holding a light. No figure standing in the shadows. Just the empty, desolate alley, stretching out before me. My pulse quickened, panic rising in my chest. I spun around, my breath coming faster, and ran. I didn't care if there was anyone behind me anymore. I didn't care what it was. I just needed to get out of that alley, out of that space where the light kept flickering and the shadows pressed in. My feet pounded against the pavement, my mind too full of fear to think clearly, too full of the image of that light flashing again and again. I reached the end of the alley, but when I stepped into the street, everything froze. I stopped in my tracks, unable to move. I didn't understand what I was seeing. The world had changed. The street was different. It was the same street I had walked down earlier, but the buildings were different now. The shops, the street lights, the signs, everything was wrong. The street was darker, the lights flickering like dying stars, the buildings taller and more looming. The entire atmosphere had shifted in the span of seconds. I turned around, trying to figure out how I had gotten here, but the alley I had just come through wasn't there anymore. It was gone. The place where I had just been standing was now just a stretch of empty street. No sign of the alley, no sign of the buildings that had been there moments ago. I looked around, trying to make sense of it, but the world around me seemed unfamiliar, twisted. The familiar landmarks I thought I knew so well were gone. The street was silent, the echoes of the night deeper and darker than before, and that's when I heard it, a soft sound, like a whisper, but so faint I wasn't sure if I was hearing it at all. It was coming from the direction of the alley that no longer existed. You shouldn't have looked. I froze, my blood running. Cold as the voice seemed to come from all around me, from the empty space where the alley had been. The words were soft, barely audible, but clear enough that they sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, my legs moving without thought, my body propelled by the panic coursing through my veins. I didn't know where I was running to, but I had to get away from that place, from that alley, from whatever was watching me. The city around me was unfamiliar, the streets twisting, the lights flickering in unnatural patterns, and as I ran, I felt it. That flash of light, the one that had followed me, that had haunted me. It was still there, somewhere in the distance, waiting for me to look back. But I didn't. I couldn't. It was one of those evenings when the world feels like it's just a little bit out of sync. The sky had that strange twilight hue, the colors a mix of orange and purple, but it never quite settled into the night. The weather was still warm for this time of year, yet there was something about the air that made it feel off, as if the evening were pretending to be one thing, but it was something else entirely. I had walked to the park, not for any particular reason, just to clear my head after a long day. The park was quiet, too quiet. There were a few people scattered around, someone walking their dog, a couple sitting on the far bench, but the park, despite the warm evening air, felt too still. The trees, usually full of life at dusk, were oddly silent, their branches barely moving as if the wind had forgotten how to blow. I walked past the flower beds, the fading sunlight casting long shadows on the ground, and eventually made my way to the central bench by the pond. There was no one there when I first arrived, just the empty bench facing the water. I sat down, letting out a long sigh, trying to shake the weight of the day off. The calm of the park, however, wasn't helping. The quiet had started to feel more like an oppressive presence. I glanced around, not quite sure why I was so uneasy. Nothing was wrong, nothing had happened, but it felt like something was waiting. That's when I saw her. She was sitting on the bench across from mine, facing the opposite direction. Her figure slouched in the way people do when they're lost in their thoughts. Her coat was dark, the color blending into the shadowed surroundings, her hair long and hanging loosely around her shoulders. Her posture was relaxed, but there was an eerie stillness about her, like she wasn't quite in this moment, like she didn't belong here. I noticed her, but I didn't think much of it at first. People sat in the park all the time, lost in thought, enjoying the quiet. But the longer I sat there, the more the unease crept in. Something about her felt wrong. I looked away, focusing on the soft ripple of the pond's water, trying to distract myself from the strange sensation that something wasn't right. But the feeling wouldn't leave. It only grew stronger. I glanced back at her. And this time I noticed something odd. The weather hadn't changed. The sky was still a strange shade of orange and purple, the evening still warm. And yet, she was sitting there, her coat buttoned up tightly around her, as though she were cold and comfortably cold. Her shoulders were hunched, her face turned slightly to the side, and she was staring off into the distance, her eyes distant and unfocused. I watched her for a few moments, trying to make sense of it. Why was she sitting there, in the middle of a warm evening, dressed like it was winter? I couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for something. I decided to get up, the urge to move, to leave the bench and the park, growing stronger. I walked around the path for a while, trying to focus on the stillness of the trees, the chirping of the distant birds, anything that might help calm my nerves. But when I came back to the bench, she was still there. I couldn't understand why I hadn't noticed it before. But as I walked closer, I realized she wasn't just sitting there in silence. She was staring not at the horizon, not at the park, but at me. Her eyes were locked on me with such intensity that it made my skin crawl. They were wide, too wide, and empty in a way I couldn't explain. There was no warmth, no emotion in her gaze. She was just looking, waiting. My heart started to beat faster, and I suddenly wanted to leave, wanted to get away from the park, from her, from that feeling of being watched. But something held me there. I couldn't turn away. I stood frozen, just a few feet from her, trying to understand what was happening, trying to figure out why she felt like a ghost, like something unnatural. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, and the park grew darker, the shadows stretching long across the grass. But as the light changed, the air stayed still. It was as though the evening had frozen in time. The woman on the bench didn't move. Not a muscle. She just sat there, eyes fixed on me. The cool evening air grew more oppressive as the shadows deepened. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was still rooted to the spot, the strange pull of her gaze too much to resist. It wasn't until the wind started to pick up gently at first, then stronger, that I realized something wasn't right with the rest of the park either. The trees, which had been so still just moments before, were now swaying violently in the wind, their branches creaking, their leaves rustling. But the woman on the bench, she wasn't moving, not a single hair on. Her head shifted in the breeze. I took a step back, unease twisting in my stomach. The wind, the sounds of the park, the feeling of the air pushing against my skin. They felt like they were all happening in a different world, one where she didn't belong. Something wasn't right. I turned quickly, not daring to look back at the bench, and made my way out of the park. My steps were quick, my heartbeat thudding in my chest, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, I could feel her presence. I could sense her eyes on me, even though I couldn't bring myself to look back. When I reached the park's exit, I finally allowed myself to glance over. She was still sitting there. She hadn't moved. But the wind was blowing again, stronger this time, and the rest of the park had shifted. The trees were bent low, their branches twisting in unnatural directions, the streetlights flickering as if they were struggling to stay on. And yet, the woman's figure was still, her coat wrapped tightly around her, her eyes wide, her face cold and expressionless. I turned and left. The market was always busy, always bustling with life. People coming and going, shouting to each other across the street. bargaining with vendors, haggling for the best prices. The vendors' stalls were a hodgepodge of goods, fruits, vegetables, spices, homemade jewelry, and clothes, everything a person could need, and then some. But on this particular afternoon, as I walked down the narrow, crowded street, something felt off. The air was thick, the noise felt muffled, and the usual vibrancy of the market seemed just a little too subdued. I didn't think much of it at first. I was used to the market's oddities. The streets were always crowded, always full of life. But today, as I walked between the stalls, I noticed something strange. The items on the tables, things I'd seen 1,000 times before, seemed different. At first, it was the spices. I walked past a stall where the usual colorful bags of cinnamon, cumin, and paprika were displayed. But something was wrong. The bags didn't have labels, not the usual ones. They were just blank, as if the spices had come from nowhere, as if they didn't have a name, a place to belong. I leaned closer to the table, trying to read the price tag. But there was no price tag, nothing but an empty space where one should have been. I backed away quickly, uneasy. Maybe it was just the way the light hit the stall, or maybe I was imagining things. But the longer I walked, the stranger everything seemed. Next, I came to a stand selling trinkets, small wooden carvings, and delicate pieces of jewelry. But as I stepped closer, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The pieces on display, wooden figurines, colorful glass beads, were distorted, warped. The carvings, which should have been human shapes, were twisted into unnatural forms. Their features stretched in strange and impossible ways. There were rings too, but none of them had any markings on them, no gemstones, nothing to indicate what they were made of. They were just metal bands, plain and lifeless. I took a step back, glancing around the market. The noise of the crowd was louder now, the chatter growing in volume, but it felt distant, like it was happening behind a thick wall. I walked farther down the row, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I saw it. A small stall, tucked in the corner of the market, nearly hidden behind a few larger vendors. There were no signs, no obvious display, just a faded cloth draped over a wooden table. I walked closer, curiosity getting the better of me, and when I reached the table, I stopped dead in my tracks. The items on the table didn't belong. They didn't even make sense. There were books, sold leather-bound books, but the covers were blank. No titles, no markings, just smooth, unbroken leather. I picked one up, instinctively drawn to it, but when I opened it, there were no pages inside. The book was empty, a hollow shell with no content, no reason for it to even exist. Beside the books were what looked like small, delicate vases. They were beautiful, crafted with an elegance that spoke of great skill, but as I reached out to touch one, I realized something disturbing. They were completely empty, not in the sense that they were hollow inside, but there was nothing to fill them. They were just shapes, standing there, waiting for something that would never come. I could feel a strange coldness emanating from them, as if they were somehow alive but trapped in their stillness. I backed away slowly, my stomach twisting. This wasn't just odd, it was wrong. I turned to leave the stall, but something made me pause. At the far end of the table, I saw a small, tarnished mirror. It was lying face down, almost hidden beneath a cloth. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it. I reached out and lifted the mirror, the metal cold in my hand, and when I turned it over, my breath caught. There was nothing in the reflection. No reflection of the market. No reflection of me. Just the empty glass. It was like looking into an abyss. An endless void that seemed to stare back at me. I blinked, expecting the reflection to change, but it didn't. It remained dark, empty. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the mirror, and placed it back on the table. I turned to walk away, but as I did, something caught my eye, small piece of paper, tucked beneath one of the empty vases. I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling slightly, and when I unfolded it, my heart skipped a beat. The paper was blank, completely blank. But when I looked closer, I saw the faintest impression of words, as if something had been written on it, only to be erased. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the words never fully materialized. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I turned away, needing to leave, but when I glanced around the market, everything felt wrong. The crowds that had been there moments ago were gone. The noise of the market had vanished, replaced by an eerie silence. The air felt heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only one left in the world. I started to walk faster, weaving through the empty stalls, but it didn't feel like I was moving forward. It felt like I was trapped in place, like the ground beneath my feet was spinning, pulling me back toward the center of the market. The buildings around me seemed to blur, their shapes shifting in the corner of my eye. I looked over my shoulder and saw the same stall again, the one with the vases and the mirror, the one with the empty books. How had I gotten back here so quickly? I hadn't turned around. I hadn't walked in circles. But the stall was right there, the empty items still on display, waiting for me. I walked past it again, my footsteps echoing in the silence. And just as I thought I had moved away, I felt it again, a flash of light, a sudden pull, like something was reaching for me from within the shadows. I turned to look back, and the stall was gone. Not gone in the way things disappear when they're moved or taken. It was just missing. There was no trace of it, no sign that it had ever been there at all. The space where it had been was just an empty stretch of pavement, like a hole in reality. I kept walking, faster now, my mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening, but the market wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't just the stalls that were missing, it was the people. There was no one around. The streets that had been full of life were now empty, the air too still. I finally reached the exit of the market, but as I stepped out onto the street, I realized something even worse. I wasn't in the city anymore. The buildings I had passed earlier were gone, replaced by empty, dilapidated structures, their windows shattered, their doors hanging loosely on their hinges. The streets stretched endlessly ahead of me, but there were no signs, no familiar landmarks. I was somewhere else, somewhere that didn't belong, and the strangest part, I had never seen this place before, but the unease was familiar. The market was still there, somewhere behind me, waiting, and I was never supposed to leave. It was late, the city had quieted down, the usual hum of evening traffic replaced by the occasional distant car, or the soft murmur of late-night conversation. I was exhausted, my mind still buzzing from the chaos of the day, and all I wanted was to escape for a while. I had no particular plans, no movie I was dying to see. I just needed to sit in the dark for a couple of hours, away from the world. I wandered past the old movie theater, the neon lights above its entrance flickering faintly in the dark. It was a small, almost forgotten place, tucked between two tall buildings. The kind of theater that didn't get many patrons anymore, but I had always liked it. It felt like stepping into another world, quiet, unassuming, with the smell of popcorn and the faint hum of the projector whirring in the background. The marquee above the door read now, showing a list of movies that didn't quite fit the typical blockbuster lineup. Nothing special, nothing new, just the same odd, eclectic mix of films that had been playing there for years. But tonight, for some reason, I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was the silence of the city, or maybe I just needed to get out of my own head. I bought a ticket from the lone attendant behind the counter and made my way through the dimly lit hallway. The theater was old, the seats faded and worn, but the charm of it never lost its appeal. It felt like the kind of place you could lose yourself in, where time moved slower, where the world outside didn't matter. I entered the screening room, the door creaking slightly as I pushed it open. The familiar smell of buttered popcorn and stale air greeted me. But when I stepped inside, something felt off. The room was empty, completely empty. I blinked, expecting to see a few scattered people, maybe one or two sitting in the middle rows like I'd seen on countless other nights, but the seats were all vacant. It was strange. I hadn't expected a crowd, but the emptiness of it hit me harder than I thought it would. I looked at the screen, expecting to see a movie, the usual flicker of images, the opening credits rolling. But there was nothing. The screen was dark, completely black. I hesitated. Was I too early? Was there some sort of delay? But the theater seemed still, too still. The air felt heavier, like the building itself was waiting for something. I took a seat in the middle, a few rows back from the screen, and waited. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but the emptiness gnawed at me. It was too quiet, too empty. The silence of the room began to press in on me, the stillness growing thicker with every second. A few minutes passed, nothing happened. I glanced around, expecting the lights to dim, the screen to flicker to life, but the room remained unchanged. The only sound was the faint hum of the old projector, its whirring a constant, almost imperceptible noise in the background. It should have been comforting, but instead, it only made the silence feel worse, like something was missing. Something I couldn't quite place. I stood up, my feet making a soft sound against the carpet, and walked toward the front. The screen was still black, still blank. I looked at the projector in the corner, wondering if something had gone wrong. Maybe it wasn't working, but the projector was running. I could see the small light blinking on it, the faint glow of its bulb shining through the shadows. I took a step forward, closer to the screen, but nothing changed. No flicker, no sound. The screen stayed dark, as if it were waiting for me to do something, as though it were waiting for me to notice something I hadn't yet seen. That's when I heard it, a soft, rustling sound, barely audible at first, like someone shifting in their seat. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone sitting behind me, but the seats were still empty. The entire theater was still empty. I looked back at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The rustling sound was getting louder now, almost like whispers, faint but distinct. It was coming from the screen, or at least, that's what it sounded like. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my eyes glued to the dark screen, and that's when I saw it, a shadow. At first it was small, barely noticeable, but as I focused on it, it grew. The shadow began to stretch across the screen, slowly at first, but then faster, expanding into an elongated shape, its edges fuzzy and distorted, like a cloud of ink spilling across the film. It was as if the darkness itself was bleeding onto the screen, consuming it. I took a step back, my breath shallow, but the shadow didn't stop. It grew larger and larger, twisting into shapes that didn't make sense, as if the darkness were alive, trying to form something, trying to manifest. I turned toward the exit, the instinct to leave growing stronger, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. The shadow had now completely overtaken the screen, blotting out whatever image had been there before, and now the entire screen was filled with swirling blackness. It was as though the theater had become part of the darkness, like it was being swallowed by it. The whispers came again, louder this time, filling the room, but they weren't words. They were just sounds, unintelligible, overlapping, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. I couldn't understand them, but I felt them crawling up my spine, twisting around my mind. They were pulling me in, forcing me to listen, to pay attention. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to break out of the theater and never look back. But the darkness, the shadow, was holding me, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The screen went completely dark again. The whispers ceased. The shadow was gone. It was as though nothing had happened at all, but I could still feel it, the weight of it, the pressure it left behind. I wasn't sure if it was still there, waiting, but I couldn't bring myself to look at the screen again. I turned around quickly, making my way to the exit as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The theater was still empty, the silence now deafening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I reached the door, pulled it open, and stepped into the hallway. The familiar hum of the theater's air conditioning greeted me, but the weight of the experience still pressed against me. I couldn't make sense of it. The silence, the shadow, the whispers, it was all too much, too strange. I glanced back at the door, the familiar movie theater entrance staring back at me, but I couldn't bring myself to go back in. It was just another evening, the kind where the air feels cool and heavy, the kind where you don't expect anything out of the ordinary, yet somehow you feel like something is about to happen. I was walking down the street, the familiar hum of the city surrounding me, the sounds of traffic in the distance, the faint murmur of people talking as they passed by. It wasn't late, but the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. I wasn't in a hurry. I wasn't really thinking about anything in particular, just lost in the rhythm of my steps, the steady cadence of my walk. But as I passed a small park, I saw her. She was standing by the sidewalk, her back to me, her hair blowing gently in the breeze. At first, I didn't think much of her. People stand on the streets all the time, waiting for something or someone. But as I got closer, she turned to face me. I don't know why, but the moment I saw her face, a chill ran through me. Her expression was neutral, but there was something in her eyes that I couldn't place a flicker of recognition. Maybe, or perhaps it was just my imagination. She seemed familiar, though I couldn't say from where. She took a step toward me, blocking my path slightly, but not in an aggressive way. She wasn't standing too close, just enough to make me pause. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Can I ask you something?" I stopped, nodding slightly, my mind racing to process the odd feeling that had settled in my chest. There was something unsettling about her presence, but I couldn't put my finger on it. She wasn't threatening, not by any means, but the way she spoke, it was like I had heard her voice before. "Sure," I said, not sure what else to say. Her gaze softened, and she stepped a little closer, her hands tucked neatly in the pockets of her coat. I could smell something faint like lavender, and for a moment, it felt oddly comforting, like I was talking to someone I should know. "You're new here, aren't you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. There was a faint smile on her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. I blinked, confused. "No, I've been around for a while. I walk through here every evening." She didn't react right away. Instead, she just looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was searching for something in my expression. There was something strange about the way she was studying me, something that made the air around us feel heavier. I shifted uncomfortably on my feet, suddenly aware of how cold the evening had become. "You sure?" she asked again, her voice still soft, but with an edge of something I couldn't place. "Yeah," I said again, but the words didn't feel as sure this time. I felt like I was being pulled into something that wasn't quite right. She was looking at me with such intensity, as though she was waiting for me to say the wrong thing, to make a mistake. Before I could say anything else, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a cruel one either. It was something in between, an empty, hollow smile that didn't reach her eyes. And then, as if the weight of the moment was finally too much, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Her voice, it came from behind me. I felt a sudden rush of air, as though someone had just walked past me. I spun around so fast, my heart leaped in my chest, but there was no one there. No one standing on the sidewalk, no one in the park. I turned back to face her, my breath caught in my throat. She was still standing there, her expression the same, but her lips hadn't moved when she spoke. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her voice, that soft, calm voice, had come from behind me. I didn't know how she could have spoken without moving her lips, how she could have been talking to me from two places at once. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. What did you say?" Her eyes widened, and her smile grew, but this time, there was something unsettling in the way she looked at me. I said, "Don't turn around. Don't look behind." "You?" I felt a surge of panic, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. My pulse quickened, and before I could stop myself, my head turned slightly. I could feel something behind me, something that wasn't right, but I couldn't bring myself to look. "Don't," she said again, this time her voice clearly coming from behind me, though she hadn't moved a muscle. "Don't look," she whispered, her voice now in my ear, cold and unmistakably close. I turned quickly, my heart racing as I looked into her face again. But her eyes weren't just empty. They were waiting. Her smile didn't reach them, not like before. It was like something was happening behind those eyes, something I wasn't supposed to see. I tried to back away, but my legs felt frozen, unwilling to obey. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could, I heard the sound of someone's footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible, but they were close, too close. I turned again, but still, there was no one behind me. I felt a tug at my chest, a magnetic pull toward the space just behind me, and the urge to look over. My shoulder grew unbearable. My eyes darted between her face and the empty air behind me. The seconds stretched on, each one longer than the last, until I could feel the hairs on my neck standing on end. "Please," she said softly, as if pleading, her voice not coming from her mouth, but from somewhere inside me, inside my very thoughts. "Don't look. Just stay with me." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The urge to look, to turn around, was overwhelming, but her words were too powerful. They twisted inside me, like a warning I couldn't ignore. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps stopped. I didn't hear the air moving. I didn't hear the subtle rustle of clothing. There was nothing behind me. I closed my eyes, pressing my hands to my ears, trying to drown out the whispers in my head. It felt like the air around me was too still, the world pressing in on me from all sides. When I opened my eyes again, she was gone. Just like that. The park was empty again. The street was quiet. I turned, my breath shallow, scanning the empty sidewalk, but there was no sign of her, no trace that she had ever been there. The only thing left was the feeling of something still watching me, still waiting, but this time, it wasn't behind me, it was inside me. I had just missed the bus. It wasn't a big deal, not at first. I was used to waiting for the next one, the usual 10-minute interval before the next vehicle arrived, bringing with it a sense of impatience that quickly faded once I was on board. But that night, for reasons I couldn't quite place, the feeling lingered longer. I stood at the bus stop, watching the traffic lights change in their usual rhythm. Green, yellow, red, back to green. It was a quiet street. Not much traffic at this time of night. Just the occasional car passing through. The sound of tires on the wet asphalt mixing with the faint hum of streetlights flickering overhead. The air had that crispness that comes just before the world settles into night. But it was still warm, comfortable. But then something strange happened. The light turned green for the cars, as it always did, and I expected to see the usual flood of traffic. But nothing moved. The cars stayed there, frozen, their headlights glaring into the night. The few vehicles in front of me were parked in place, their engines silent, their drivers still behind the wheel, not moving, not even shifting their posture. I glanced around, half expecting to see a crowd of pedestrians, the usual bustling energy of the street. But the sidewalk was empty. There was no one around, no one except me, standing at the bus stop. I checked the time on my phone. The bus was coming soon. I looked back up at the lights, watching the green lights stay solid, unmoving, like a signal stuck in time. My eyes flicked to the cars again. They weren't even idling. They were just still. The engines should have been running. The tires should have been moving. The sound of rubber against pavement should have filled the air. But there was only silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. I felt a weird tension in the air, like the world had paused for just a moment, waiting for something, but nothing changed. I waited. The bus was still a few minutes away, but the longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I felt. I shifted on my feet, glancing up at the traffic lights again, and the more I watched them, the more I realized that something was wrong. The colors didn't flicker. They didn't change. They stayed the same, fixed in place. The green light, the one meant for the cars, just stayed there, glaring at me, like a command that wasn't being obeyed. The red lights for the crosswalk remained steady, untouched. It was as if the entire intersection was frozen in time. I walked closer to the edge of the curb, half expecting to see the street move again, to see the cars finally drive off, the bus pull up, and everything go back to normal. But still, nothing happened. I could hear my own footsteps echo in the street, too loud against the stillness. I was standing alone in the middle of a world that was waiting. I took a few more steps forward, closer to the intersection, my gaze flicking from the still cars to the unblinking lights. It was hard to breathe, like the air had thickened, each breath heavier than the last. I felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone. I couldn't explain why I was so uneasy, but the longer I stood there, the more suffocating the silence became. I turned around, looking for any sign of movement, but the sidewalk was just as empty as before. The buildings around me loomed, their windows dark, but there was no sign of life, no sound. The world outside seemed frozen, locked in place, just like the cars at the intersection. I looked at the street again, my mind working overtime to make sense of the situation. Had something happened? Had I missed something? The clock on my phone told me I hadn't been waiting long enough for this to be odd. Just a few minutes. A few minutes of stillness. But it felt like hours. I felt the first stirrings of panic. What if the bus was never coming? What if I had missed it already, somehow, and now I was stuck, waiting for something that would never arrive? I glanced up at the sky, searching for something familiar, but all I saw were the faint stars peeking through the clouded sky. It was then that I noticed something else, the people. I hadn't seen them at first, but as my gaze moved across the intersection, I saw them. There were figures inside the cars, their outlines faint but clear in the windows. People were sitting. They're unmoving, their heads turned toward the street, their eyes staring straight ahead, but they weren't moving. I walked closer to one of the cars, drawn to it by some inexplicable need to understand. As I peered through the window, I saw the driver, his face frozen, staring blankly at the intersection. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his fingers still, wrapped around the steering wheel. His face was pale, lifeless, and though his posture didn't shift, I could feel the presence of something wrong inside the vehicle. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath shallow. I turned away quickly, looking across the street, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. But the people in the other cars were just as still, their bodies frozen in place, their faces pale and lifeless. It was as though they were caught in time, stuck in this moment, unable to move, unable to break free. My heart began to race, and I looked back at the intersection, unable to tear my eyes away from the strange tableau. The cars, the people inside them. The traffic lights, all of it, seemed like a still photograph, trapped in an endless moment, unable to change. I reached into my pocket, my hands trembling, and tried to check my phone again, but the screen flickered for a moment before going black. No signal, no time, no escape. My chest tightened. I couldn't understand what was happening. I heard a noise, a soft scraping sound, like the faintest shift in the air, and for a moment, I thought I saw one of the cars move. But it was just the trick of the light, a fleeting impression. The cars didn't move. They stayed where they were. The lights didn't change. Everything remained frozen. I looked at the street one last time, feeling the weight of the stillness pressing in on me. But when I turned to walk away, I realized something. The street I had just walked down. It wasn't the same anymore. The buildings I had passed, the familiar landmarks, they weren't there anymore. The road stretched on, but it wasn't familiar. It wasn't the same street. It was like I had entered some parallel world, some version of the city that wasn't quite right. And when I looked behind me, the traffic lights were still glowing green. It was supposed to be a simple walk. I had finished my errands for the day, and the evening was settling in with that soft, golden light that always makes the world seem a little more manageable, a little more peaceful. I had decided to take the long way home, a detour through the quieter streets. The city wasn't far from where I lived, but sometimes it felt like escaping into a new space, even if just for a while, helped put everything into perspective. I walked through familiar streets, the kind where you don't even have to think about where you're going anymore. The same trees lined the sidewalk, the same storefronts with familiar windows, the same old buildings that made the city feel like a second skin. I turned the corner onto the street that would take me home. It was quiet, but not unnervingly so. The street was almost empty, except for a few people lingering on their porches. The occasional jogger passing by, their feet tapping lightly on the pavement. Nothing unusual, just another evening in the city. But as I walked further down, something began to feel off. The quiet stretched on longer than it should have. The farther I went, the quieter it became. I glanced around at the houses, but none of them seemed particularly familiar. They were the same as always, row houses, with small yards and stoops, but somehow the street felt different. It felt like something was missing, or maybe something had changed that I couldn't place. I walked a little faster, the uneasy feeling settling deeper in my stomach. Maybe it was just the fact that the sun was sinking lower in the sky, the shadows growing longer, the light starting to fade in that eerie, in-between time between day and night. But the further I went, the more out of place everything seemed. The buildings started to look a little off, as if they weren't quite the same as the ones I'd passed a minute ago. Their windows didn't reflect the sky the way they should. The streetlights, though not yet on, seemed to flicker at the corners of my vision, their light barely enough to make out the shapes of the buildings around me. I shook my head, dismissing the strange thoughts. I must have been tired. I had been walking for a while, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. But then I turned the corner. I had walked this street countless times before. The road ahead should have led to the familiar intersection, the one that took me to my block. It was the last turn before I'd be home. I knew the path well, but as I stepped around the corner, I realized something was wrong. There was no end. The street just kept going. I took another step forward, thinking that perhaps I had missed the intersection, or that I hadn't made the turn I thought I had. I glanced behind me, but the corner I had just turned was already too far away to see. There was nothing behind me, just the same endless stretch of road ahead. I kept walking, thinking maybe I had gotten confused, that it was just a slight shift in my perception of the street. But no matter how far I walked, the end of the street never came into view. There were houses, of course, at least, I assumed. They were houses, but they all seemed distant, blurry in the growing dusk. I couldn't quite make out their details, but I knew they were there, stretched out before me in this never-ending road. I stopped walking. It was impossible. Streets had endings. Roads led somewhere, but this street didn't have an end. It just stretched on, endless. The further I went, the more the world around me began to warp. The shadows grew longer, the streetlights flickered, and the sound of my footsteps echoed too loudly in the growing silence. It was too quiet, too still. I turned around again, expecting to see the corner I had come from, the one I had turned moments ago. But it was gone. There was no corner. There was no intersection, just the same street, the same endless road. Panic began to rise in my chest. This couldn't be happening. I had just walked a few steps down the street, and yet it had turned into something unrecognizable. I had walked here hundreds of times before, and the street had always been the same. But now, it was different no matter how far I walked. No matter how many steps I took, I was stuck in the same place. I turned to face the houses again, hoping to find something, anything familiar, but they only seemed to blur the further I went. The road stretched on, curving slightly as it disappeared into the horizon, but it was like it didn't end. I was moving, but nothing was changing. The silence felt suffocating. My breath was too loud. The city had disappeared, the distant sounds of cars, the hum of voices, all swallowed up by the strange stillness of the street. I walked faster now, my pace quickening, but the feeling that I was trapped in some kind of loop was overwhelming. The houses were the same, but they weren't. The road was endless, but it wasn't. It was all distorted. The world had begun to bend in a way that felt wrong. The streetlights flickered again, and then they went out, one by one, until the only light came from the fading glow of the sky above me. And still, the road didn't end. I walked faster, almost running now, the panic swelling inside me. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against me, like the world was squeezing me into a corner I couldn't escape. Finally, I reached a point where the road seemed to turn into something else vast. Empty space where the buildings faded away, and the pavement dissolved into dirt and gravel. The world beyond this place didn't exist. There was nothing else. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath ragged as I turned in every direction. There was no sound, no movement. The street had vanished, leaving me in the middle of a vast empty void. There was nothing in front of me. There was no way out. And as I stood there, waiting for something to change, I realized the most terrifying part. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. There was no corner I had turned, no path that had led me. The street hadn't ended, had just become nothing, and I was still standing in the same spot, trapped in a place that wasn't even real. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And the worst part was that I knew, deep down, there would never be an end. The street would never stop, and I would never leave. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world feels like it's winding down, the hustle and bustle of the day starting to fade into a peaceful lull. I had just finished a long shift at work, and the walk to the train station felt like a relief, a small break from the chaos. The air was cool, with that crispness that comes at the end of the day, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving only the soft glow of streetlights. The station wasn't far from my apartment, just a short walk, and I often took the same route. The train ride home was always a familiar comfort, a small window of time to unwind before I reached the safety of my own space. The platform was mostly empty when I arrived, the usual rush of commuters already gone, their trains long past. I wasn't in a hurry. I leaned against the railing, staring at the tracks ahead. I checked my watch. There was still time before the next train, but something about the station felt off tonight. The air felt heavier, like the whole place was holding its breath. The lights above flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across the platform. I shook my head, brushing off the unease as nothing more than exhaustion settling in. Had worked long hours, after all. I turned to look at the schedule board to confirm the train's arrival time. The list of trains looked normal, but the moment I glanced at the times, I noticed something strange. The train I was waiting for, the one that should have been arriving in just a few minutes, wasn't listed. The time was blank. No arrival time. Just an empty space where it should have been. I frowned and checked my phone. The schedule there matched the board, but now I felt the first stirrings of discomfort. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I pulled out my headphones, thinking maybe some music would help calm the strange unease creeping up my spine. But just as I was about to plug them in, I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the platform, facing the tracks. At first, I didn't think much of her. She was just another commuter, waiting for the train, her features obscured by the dim light of the station. But then I noticed how still she was. She wasn't moving. Her back was straight, her posture rigid, as if she were frozen in place. Her eyes locked on the empty tracks ahead of her. It was strange. Everyone else at the station moved, shifted their weight, checked their watches, paced nervously as they waited. But this woman didn't move at all. A part of me thought about walking over to her, asking if she needed help, but I couldn't quite bring myself to do it. I found myself staring at her, almost drawn to her stillness. I didn't know why, but something about her presence unsettled me. It was like she wasn't supposed to be there, like she was out of place in this otherwise quiet, empty station. Minutes passed, and I checked the schedule again. Still no change. I shifted on my feet, trying to distract myself. The sound of the train tracks was the only noise, a steady hum that almost felt like it was vibrating through the ground. But then I heard something else, footsteps. I looked around, but the platform was still empty. The woman was still standing at the far end, and I was the only one near the tracks. The footsteps continued, and I felt a chill creep over me. The sound was growing closer, but when I turned, no one was there. I turned again, more urgently this time, but the train station was still deserted. I looked back at the woman. She hadn't moved an inch. I glanced at the schedule board again. Still no time for the next train. Just empty space where the information should have been. I walked toward her, unsure of what was drawing me closer, but unable to stop myself. As I got closer, I realized she was wearing a dark coat, her long hair hanging loose over her shoulders. She looked ordinary enough, but her stillness was unnerving. She wasn't even looking around. She was just staring at the tracks, as if waiting for something, waiting for someone. "Excuse me," I called, my voice softer than I expected. As if the silence of the station had swallowed my words before they could reach her. "Are you all right?" She didn't respond. I took a few more steps toward her, but as I moved, I noticed something strange. The sound of my footsteps didn't echo. It should have. The station was almost empty, but the noise of my feet against the pavement was swallowed by the silence, as if the world around me were muffling every sound I made. "Hey," I said again, a little louder, my heart beating a little faster. "Are you waiting for the train?" She didn't answer, but now I was close enough to see her face. She wasn't looking at me, but I could see her expression. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and there was something unsettling about the way she looked at the tracks, like she wasn't seeing them at all. It was as if she were looking at something that wasn't there, staring into an empty space only she could see. I stepped closer, just a few feet away now. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is everything okay?" And then, for the first time, she moved. Her head shifted slightly, but her eyes never left the tracks. Her lips parted, and her voice came out in a low murmur, barely audible above the stillness of the station. "Don't wait for the train," she said. "It's not coming." I froze, unsure if I had heard her correctly. It felt like time slowed down for a moment, the air hanging thick with the weight of her words. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, she tilted her head slightly, as if she were listening to something far off. Her gaze never left the tracks, and yet I felt like she was staring right through me. "Don't wait for it," she repeated, her voice quieter now, almost distant. "The train never comes." I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at the tracks, then back at her. The station was still empty. The train wasn't coming. The schedule board was still blank. I glanced at my watch. Nothing had changed. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. The sound of the train grew louder, distant but growing. The rumble, the faint screech of the metal against the tracks, but I couldn't see it. No train appeared. The sound continued, and yet there was nothing in front of me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I turned back to the woman. She was still standing there, her eyes now turned toward me, and for the first time, I saw something shift in her gaze. A flicker of recognition, a knowing. The train station was silent again, and the woman wasn't there anymore. I looked around, frantic now. The platform was empty, the shadows lengthening in the dim light of the station. I turned back toward the tracks, but there was nothing in sight. No train, no sign of movement, just the empty platform stretching before me. I was alone. The lights above flickered once, twice, then dimmed, as if the station itself were breathing in and out. And all that remained was the oppressive silence. The train would never come, not here, not now. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it never would. The city always looked different at night. The lights, the energy, The way everything seemed to hum with life, it felt like a different world. A second chance to escape the demands of the day. I had just finished my shift, the exhaustion heavy on my shoulders, and I was walking home through the streets, my footsteps lost in the steady murmur of the night. I'd been walking this route for weeks, passing the same street corner, the same blinking neon signs, the same hustle and bustle of the late-night crowd. Nothing unusual, just another night, just another walk. But tonight, something felt off. I don't know why I noticed it at first. Maybe it was because I had walked down this street 100 times before, but tonight, the neon sign in the window of the electronics store caught my eye. It wasn't the usual advertisement for cheap gadgets or new phone models. It was flashing something different. A strange flicker, like the sign was malfunctioning. I stopped for a moment, just out of curiosity. The sign blinked erratically, flashing in bursts. For a second, it was just the usual flashing text, new arrivals, but then something changed. The screen flickered again, and for an instant the text disappeared, and there it was, my face. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. It was just a flash, a brief, fleeting moment, but there was no mistaking it. There, on the neon sign, was my face. It looked like a photograph of me, one I didn't recognize, but it was undeniably mine. The face stared back at me, eyes wide, expression frozen in some kind of strange confusion. The photo was blurry, grainy, as though it was old, but it was unmistakably me. I blinked, confused, my mind trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it a glitch? Some kind of advertising malfunction? But as I looked closer, the picture stayed. The face didn't change. The sign flickered again, and the image disappeared, replaced by the usual flashing ad. The moment passed, and I found myself standing in front of the store, unsure of what to think. My legs felt heavy, as though I were rooted to the spot. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked the time. The bus would be here soon, and I needed to move, but something kept me there, staring at the sign. It was ridiculous. It was probably just a weird coincidence, a malfunction, a visual trick. But my heart was racing. I turned and kept walking, trying to push the thought out of my mind. But as I walked, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My face, up there on that sign, like I was part of the advertisement. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. It wasn't a big deal. It was just a malfunction, nothing more. I had to be imagining things, but as I reached the next corner, I stopped. Something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. Another sin, the same neon lights, the same flashing colors, only this time, it wasn't just a glitch. It was the same damn thing. My face. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the sign across the street. It was the same as before, only now the image was clearer, more detailed. I couldn't look away. The eyes in the photograph seemed to follow me. I took a step back, confused, my heart hammering in my chest. The image was changing, slowly, subtly, but it was still me. It was still my face, only it was more detailed now, more lifelike. I saw the expression shift slightly, just enough for me to feel it. The eyes seemed aware. I turned quickly, almost running now, wanting to leave, to forget it. But as I passed the next few stores, I saw more signs, more faces, more versions of myself staring back at me. Each time they were different, more detailed, their expressions changing with each flicker of light. I felt like I was being watched, not just by the people around me, but by these faceless, unblinking versions of me, flickering and shifting on the signs, in the windows, in the reflections of the glass. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't understand what was happening. The signs kept flashing my face, and no matter how fast I walked, no matter where I turned, they followed me. I found myself on a quieter street, the noise of the city fading. Behind me, I slowed down, breathing heavily, trying to regain control of my thoughts. But when I turned the corner onto the next block, I stopped dead in my tracks. The sign, it wasn't a store sign this time, it was a billboard. The image was even clearer now, brighter, more vivid. My face, larger than life, staring down at me from the towering billboard. But this time, it wasn't just my face. It was me, but not MIT was distorted, like a warped version of myself. My eyes were wide and hollow, my expression twisted into something that wasn't fear, but something else, something darker. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I backed away, the image of my distorted face burning into my mind. I turned away, desperate to escape the gaze of that thing that looked like me. But when I glanced at the next sign, the same face stared back at me. Only this time, it was smiling. A wide, unsettling grin that didn't belong to me. I turned again, running now, my breath short, my body tense with the need to escape. But no matter how fast I ran, the signs never stopped. They never stopped flashing my face, my eyes, my smile. I looked up, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in the distance. A figure, standing just beyond the reach of the streetlights, watching me. But when I looked closer, it was just another sign. Just another version of me staring down at me. And in the flickering light, I realized, with growing horror, that the signs weren't just showing my face. They were showing me. They were showing me where I was going. And they were showing me what was coming.